Princes and Priests, Chapter 19, Battle of the Nomads. Panic was about to set in, and Tavia was ready to cry as she desperately searched for Travis. She finally found him standing on the hill ridge, looking out over the battle below. He held his little elbows tight in his hands. She ran across to her son and caught him up in her arms, wrapping her cloak about him. It was then that she started to cry. She hid her tears on his tiny shoulder. Travis put his arm around her neck.
It's okay. Don't cry, Mother.
She sat back on her heels and looked at her beautiful boy, touching his smooth cheeks.
I had no idea where you were. I was scared.
He smiled sadly.
I was right here.
Travis, you can't just take off.
He looked at her seriously.
I was right here. I knew you were close. I was not afraid.
He looked past her to the battle below.
There are so many down there.
She turned to look. From this part of the hill line, she could see much farther than from the other part of the hill. She could see the legions far behind the battle that wouldn't be visible from the river. She wanted to cry for the utter hopelessness of the situation. Travis kept his arm around her neck.
The Nomads cannot win,
she whispered.
We will win,
Travis said softly.
but so many on the far side are there by mistake. They will die on the wrong side of the river, and they will carry that with them into the next life. It is very sad. I wish I could change that.
I wish I knew we would win, but I don't see how. Maybe we should move on while we can.
Travis shook his head.
We will win. Many powers and many heavens have seen this coming and spent much to gather in this place, at this time, to see to it. That includes us being here. You have to help too.
She squeezed her son closer.
Travis, I can't help in such a battle.
He looked at her a long moment, his deep blue eyes spinning into blackness flecked with stars for a moment.
Yes, you can,
he said softly, in the voice of a man. She bowed her head, trying not to show any fear. She wanted to be strong and be worthy of the divine voice that spoke through her son, but she was afraid to show herself at all. She did not want to be found or known. She wanted to just be a simple woman and raise her son as any other woman might. Travis lifted her face, and she looked into eyes that were portals to the depth of the universe, endless space and time.
You know what you must do.
She nodded, feeling tears on her cheeks. In a blink, the power was gone, and she was looking at her son. He sagged tiredly and wrapped his arms around her neck.
It is time for sleep,
he whispered in her ear. She gathered Travis up and carried him back into the camp. They went down through the tents of the warriors, to the tents of the women and children. Many were still busy making arrows and sharpening weapons, as well as cooking and tending to the tasks of day-to-day life. She found their tent and ducked inside. Several women were there, waiting for her. She wondered where Salma was, but set the thought aside and went on to put her son to bed. The women had all wanted to help the boy since Oirion's little company had gotten here, and, as much as she didn't want to share, she knew they had reason to wish to serve the boy. Tavia laid Travis down gently. She handed her son over and ducked out, needing some air and to breathe a little for herself. She hadn't gone far when Salma appeared and caught hold of her hand, like a scared child.
What's wrong, Salma?
Tavia asked. The little woman kept so close to her that it was almost hard to walk.
They do not like me. Please don't leave me alone with them again.
I needed to find Travis. I'm sorry. Why would they not like you? You have done nothing to them.
No, but my people are. Well, the war that made us was against them, or about them anyway. They know what I am, and they know that my people play the role of slaves in order to use others. They do not like Sphinx, and find us very much like you might think of a half-hobgoblin, half-human. Not good.
You cannot change what they think of your race or what your race was born of, but by cowering like a scared kitten, you do not show them otherwise as well. Walk with me like the princess you are. You are my friend and ally and worthy of both. Walk as such, not as a scared child.
Salma forced herself to straighten as she walked with Tavia, but it was clearly hard to do so.
Do you think they have a chance?
There is a chance. Heaven is with us. It will not be easy, and the price will be very high, but there is a hope.
Salma smiled at Tavia.
You know, Tavia, you amaze me at times. You stay so calm and so powerful. Surely one day you will be a queen. I would like to see you stand up against my mother and put her in her place. She is a queen, but with none of your inner grace.
Well, thank you, Salma. But if I am a queen and you are my friend and ally, does that not make you a queen as well?
Salma laughed a little.
No, it makes me lucky. Can we find the boys? They might need some food.
Yes, we will find them and make food and tea for them. Maybe we should try to find them on the side of the hill, though. The battle is still going and will last past dark. If I know them, they will stay to aid the wounded and try to clear the dead.
Oirion washed his hands in the river, for whatever it was worth. He had hauled as many wounded as he could find up the slopes to the tents of the healers. He had searched longer than the others, but he could find no more. All that was left were the dead. He stood for a moment looking for Even and found him not far away. He spotted the big man's silhouette against the light of a fire that was built up to warm the warriors. Cold as any, Oirion cut for it and joined his friend.
You hurt at all?
Even asked.
No, just cold.
Oirion held his hands out to the fire and tried to thaw them out.
What have you been up to? I thought you'd be up to the camp for food.
I've been collecting the dead.
Even nodded to the riverbank. Oirion squinted through the dark to see that the dead men and horses had been piled up along the steeper banks, to further hinder any attempts for the battle to get too wide.
It's an Oirion thing,
Ivan said.
It makes for a difficult wall to scale and intimidates the enemy. In this cold, there is no risk of sickness.
He sighed heavily.
I am hungry, though.
Then we are here just in time.
Salma walked up with a great basket of bread that she offered to all at the fire.
It isn't much, but we had to carry it a long way,
Tavia said, as she held up a large kettle of tea. The aroma of the tea was tantalizing, and all the men at the fire could smell it and gathered around.
You're a good woman,
Even laughed.
If you ever decide to thaw out and want to be treated like one, you let me know.
Tavia smiled tolerantly, but said nothing, as she poured tea into small cups that she had pulled out of a little pack slung over her shoulder. The men at the fire were all thankful for the tea, and Oirion felt better at once. Seeing her and tasting the tea, both had helped. Aches and fatigue seemed to melt away, and sleep now seemed possible. Once the kettle was empty, she nodded to them.
I have to get back to Travis. You both be careful.
She left them, walking back up the hill alone. Salma stayed with the men. They seemed to be much more at ease with her than were the women of the camp.
You mind if I curl up with you two tonight?
She asked.
I'm not sure I can find my way back in the dark.
You can curl up with me any time.
Even laughed. The tent was cold when they got to it, but Salma was happy to build the fire up for them. They were asleep before it warmed up, but when they woke, the warmth of the fire was welcome and filled the tent. Even got up to the sound of voices outside and woke Oirion with a shake. They stumbled out, leaving Salma sleeping. Together, they emerged into the cold of the pre-dawn morning. Even's nose led them to food, and they ate as they made their way back down to the river in the twilight.
They will attack early, I think,
Ivan said.
I expect they will.
Oirion agreed. He was still half asleep when they arrived at the riverbank. The fires here were embers now, but offered a little heat. They crowded in to get warm as they waited for daylight to reveal the battle that was surely about to happen. Before they could even see the far side, they could spot the torches waving orders.
What are they saying?
Even asked Oirion as he watched them. Oirion scowled and studied the motions, trying to recall the training of his youth as a priest of the Sixth Kingdom.
They are grouping up for charges, longbow men along the riverbanks and 3 cohorts to line up and charge in force,
he said cautiously.
It will be a big battle. The idea, I think, is to push in as far as they can and use their vast numbers against us. I am certain there is more to it. They will have planned the details of their strategy and magic all night.
He yawned despite himself.
I would so rather be in bed.
Ivan grinned at him.
A man might pass this up to be in bed with a grand woman, but, if nothing else, battle makes you feel alive. It's a fine morning, Oirion, and you stand with friends on the right side of the river. No, this is a good place to be.
Already the army was forming up along the far bank. They could hear them more than see them. The torches stopped moving as they found their places. The sun was beginning to rise, and Oirion could see that today the church had brought down many clerics. Not just field clerics like revolves, but the upper ranks. Their stars were embroidered in gold across their chests and left no doubt of their power. Today there would be magic, and a lot of it. The great wizards in the ranks of the priests had moved down close enough to truly affect the battle as it happened. Oirion twisted the ring he wore and wished Raven was there to support him in a way Even just had no idea about. As the sun rose, he looked up and down the river to see the nomads gathering, wearing their leather fur cloaks and feathers. Many, he noticed, wore feathers hanging off their shoulders in a way that he had not seen before. The feathers fluttered and moved in the breeze when nothing else seemed to. They had no hope, and yet, if nothing else, more nomads were here today than the day before. More clans must have arrived in the night. Neither side moved. They all were waiting for the light of day. Then, with a great whisper of magic that Oirion could almost hear, a command was given. The army began to move forward. The churchmen hit the water, trying not to falter at the cold, but to move forward in orderly fashion. More men, up and down the river, jumped in to try to find a way to drop the spikes. Nomads shot those men down, but the army didn't pause. Even drew his sword.
Whatever side wins today, Oirion, I plan to be remembered by all.
Even said grimly.
It's the same war, just another battleground.
The nomads all turned, and almost as one, clapped their hands together in a rhythm that sounded up and down the river. On the top of the hill, there appeared the shamans, the power of the nomads. The group stood still for a moment, mounted on black horses atop the hill. They split up as they moved forward, almost seeming to shimmer with power. 3 came straight for the ford. The others went up and down river. They left no area unguarded. The one in the center carried a staff with claws on top. The art on his arms glowed red, as if his blood was shining through in an enchanting and resplendent design. He wore the skull of a troll and rode the horse with an ease and silence that seemed eerily dangerous. Oirion thought to tell Theo about the man, that they had the same staff. At that moment, Oirion realized he had not seen Theo for days, and suddenly worried what his fate was. Across the river, a cleric from the front ranks raised his arms and began to cry out his prayer. The central shaman brought his horse to a standstill and tapped the staff butt on his toe. The claws snapped open, and the stone flared red. He aimed it at the priest. A single dart of red light shot across the distance and struck the priest in the chest. The dart went cleanly through him and hit the ground behind him, exploding the earth and leaving a small crater. The priest stood a moment. Gasping with a smoldering hole through his torso, he slowly toppled backwards in a stunned silence. The church let out a cry of shock and grief, almost in unison, and the nomads smiled grimly. One man even laughed at the churchman.
Wow,
Even breathed, impressed.
that leaves little question about how they feel about the use of magic.
The shaman sat on his stallion, as still as stone, bathed in the red light of his staff, waiting for more priests to show themselves. Awesome. The church demanded nothing less than all-out war now. Order was about to be broken. The men roared at the death of their priest. For the nomads, it didn't stay amusing for long. There was no more laughing. The church was simply too big to be stopped and held. The men in the river surged forward, and more rushed in after them. From the side of the charge, the clerics began to lift up magics that had not been used as of yet. The nomad cavalry charged down the hill at the surge of men and hit them hard, crushing into them with the same power as before, but the surge didn't end, and they could not seem to break free. Even roared as the nomads on horses began to be pulled down by the mob. Oirion was a step behind him as they hit the men who were focused on the horses. The nomads around them joined in, seeking to gain enough room for the horses to move and get free. The shaman in the middle charged in, swinging his staff as a weapon. The contact of the staff was more than just bone-crushing. It burned everything in close proximity with a fantastic heat beyond any fire. In the tight melee, more men were screaming with burns than had been hit with the staff. Once Even reached the first small group of horsemen, the battle changed. Even drove back the enemy, making enough space for the men on horseback to trade spears and swords for bows. They didn't regroup for another charge, but stayed and began to fire arrows as the nomads on foot held the enemy at bay. A magic net was cast out by the clerics. It was a well-known trick to slow everyone down and allow new men to push in, while those caught in the net found it almost impossible to move their feet. Oirion knew it for what it was before it hit, and he threw up his arm with a shouted banishment to dispel the net. He didn't have much hope of dispelling it entirely. He was only one hunter against at least a dozen clerics. But his own priest magics hit the net before it had even begun to descend. His magic struck the net with such force that it revealed the net spread out over the entire hillside. In a flash, visible to all, the whole net of power was burned outward from where Oirion was, like a torch put to a dry rope, until the entire thing was gone. There was no time to think about that, or wonder how he had summoned enough power to destroy it. The church was not stopping, and Oirion barely saved himself from certain death. Locked in a sword fight with a man who might have been a friend in another place, Oirion had no choice but to submit to the side of the river he stood on and disregard all the rules. He flung out wizard power with a shout. Lightning wildly exploded outward, in a fan of heat and force, into the men who pressed in at him. Many were knocked back, several smoldered and dropped dead. Others fell, screaming and thrashing in pain. For a moment, even Oirion was stunned at the raw power and the wide fan of effect he had had. It was pure luck that he had not caught any of the nomads in his untrained attack. A few of them even looked at him uncertainly. Catching his breath, he ran at the closest man with a shout and drove his sword into the young priest's chest. The young man looked at Oirion and blinked at him. For a moment just before he died, Oirion saw recognition in the eyes of the man. It was something Oirion had not thought of before now. He was a celebrity, and he knew it. While he tried to deny it, he knew that posters of him were sold for coins, and images of him floated around the world. Certainly, young members of the armed kingdoms of the church would know the famous pair of fathers Oirion and James. He pulled his sword free with a shout of heartbreaking pain and frustration, but did not stop. He turned his sword to swing blindly at the next man to attack him. He flung power at whoever was near him and lost track of the battle beyond his sword reach. Finally, he staggered over a body and fell to his knees. He remained there, panting, too tired to get up, drained of energy from the wild use of magic and the endless fighting. Even grabbed him up by the shoulder, jerking him to his feet, as the great warrior swung his sword, chopping into the man who was coming at Oirion. They just kept coming, and without rest, there was no way the far smaller army could hold back the force. Even with the shaman to counter the priests, they had no hope. Magics blasted back and forth over the river, flashing and exploding, creating gusts of warm air, pockets of foul air, and wild, unmanageable horses. The riverbank was lost, and the nomads were pushed up the slopes of their own hill, driven back by the sheer numbers of the army they faced. Even as dark came on, the battle did not stop, but the nomads held on, and eventually drove the church back toward the river. They were accustomed to the cold, and the men they fought were not. Their endurance and hard lifestyle were proving to hold out over the numbers of the church, at least for the day. Finally, the cold drove the church to recall their men. The sky was black by now, and wind started to blow in some snow. The battle was over, for now. The nomads dropped where they were, trying to stop their own bleeding wounds, and maybe even stumble up the hill for food and warmth. Somehow, Oirion reached the camp and found his way to the tent. As he stumbled in, Salma held the tent flap for him. The tent was warm, lit only by the embers of the fire. She crawled to him once he dropped to the fur-covered floor. Pushing his hands away, she helped him pull his boots off. With strong, gentle hands, she helped him out of his leather armor vest. She moved behind him and, without asking, started to massage his shoulders. He was going to object, but it was such a relief that he couldn't help but sit still. He knew she was working energy into him, and right now he needed it. He had never in his life used that much magic all at once, or at that level of power. He was worn out. He half dozed off, aware, yet not thinking at all as her hands moved to other places as well, down his back and along each arm to his fingertips. Her hands offered an ease to the pain and replenished the strength that his muscles seemed to have lost. She moved around to sit in front of him, and from the work on his hands, she found his thighs. By the time he opened his eyes, he was so relaxed that he didn't even try to draw away from her kiss. He was so lonely. His grief rose up, and he so desperately wanted to be with someone that he could not bear to even ask her to back away. It wasn't about lust or even about curiosity. It was about connecting to another soul. His hands touched her soft face as she kissed him again, so carefully it almost made him cry. This time he kissed her back. He had no thoughts of the others coming back, of rules he had to follow, of vows, or anything but touching her and letting her touch him. It was as if this was the only way to truly access each other's very lonely souls. Hours later, Salma lay beside Oirion, stroking his face as he drifted to sleep. She kissed his lips softly again.
Was that so bad?
She asked in a whisper. He touched her face softly, but didn't open his eyes or say anything. She nestled down beside him, purring. Oirion woke to the sound of men talking outside the tent. He recognized Yven's voice and opened his eyes. Salma stretched beside him and drew in a breath. She rolled up to her feet and began to add little logs to the fire before Oirion was even moving. The flames sprang up, offering light and warmth to the cooling tent. Oirion wiped the grit from his eyes, realizing what he had done last night. He could taste it in his beard, on his lips, and feel it on his skin. It flavored the air and was soft in his energies. All of it touched him pleasantly and woke him with a sense of relaxed ease that he had not felt in a long time. The most disturbing part, he realized, was that he didn't feel upset about it, but rather enjoyed the lingering memory of it. He reached for his clothes and got up. For the first time since he had gotten here, he was feeling able to move without pain. He was half-dressed when Yven ducked in. The big man had a basket of steaming meat and a skin of some sort of hot tea.
Breakfast,
Yven explained.
Where are Theo and the girls?
I haven't seen Theo for days and the girls are at another tent.
You stayed?
Yven asked Salma.
Yep, I'm not trusted around the little children.
She came over to look at the food and smiled.
I knew there was a reason they keep you.
She took the basket and sat down near to where Oirion would have to sit.
Where did you sleep, Yven? You smell funny.
It's some sort of herb that they rub on their men.
He sniffed at himself.
It's all I can smell right now.
So you don't stink, yes? Was she a widow or just impressed with the size of your, wrists?
Salma asked with a wicked smile. Yven grinned.
She was a woman,
He shrugged.
and pretty.
Aren't you a man of high standards?
She teased.
I never claimed to be.
He sat down next to her. They ate together, and then Yven happily took the empty basket. Oirion picked up his sword, buckled it on, and went out with Yven. Salma caught his arm as he did. He looked at her. She had a quiet look that he had not seen on her before.
You were serious, weren't you? Your priests really don't take women, do they?
No.
Then why did you?
That was a very good question.
I don't know, Salma.
He said.
Well, I won't tell. Anyway, before you go off to get yourself killed, I wanted to say thank you and please be careful.
He nodded and went out, not at all sure how to handle such situations, and not sure how she took it all. He wondered, after he stepped out, how was it that she knew he was not so practiced? Was he that bad at it? He pushed the thought out of his head and went to find his place at the riverbank.
Thanks for listening, but the battle is not over yet. Join our side by clicking on those like and subscribe buttons. Your support makes it so we can keep sharing content with you.